Yes, sir.
My question is about oil from the North Slope of Alaska.
Yes, sir.
Why don't we sell it to Japan, and what would be the implications of doing that?
There is the only reason we don't sell it for Japan is the same reason why we have had tariffs and protection and foreign price supports, because of the nationalistic protectionist interest. From an economic point of view, there is no doubt whatsoever that it is absolutely absurd for oil from the North Slope to be shipped down to California, to be sent over by expensive land transportation to the Middle West, and at the same time for Japan to be importing oil from the Middle East. If you allowed the markets to work, there would be no problem. There's no question that oil from the North Slope would go to Japan. But this is another case in which what is sensible is being prevented by erroneous governmental policy. Governmental policy has nowhere, in my opinion, in recent years done more harm than in the area of energy, in which we have been saying it's unpatriotic to produce oil, and if you produce oil, you're going to get hit with a heavy tax. It's patriotic to import oil, and we're going to subsidize the import of oil from abroad. It's absolutely absurd. You know, the U.S. government has a unique capacity for getting things upside down. In the days of Mr. Eisenhower, he was our greatest post-war president, so in my opinion, even though he did come from Kansas. So I'm not, but it's still a very fascinating fact that the oil interests in this country and the people in this country were concerned about the competition from cheap foreign oil. So they induced President Eisenhower to impose an import quota on the production of cheap foreign oil. So when foreign oil was cheap, we insisted that we use scarce, domestic, expensive oil and not use cheap foreign oil. Now, in the past 3 years, the situation has been reversed. Foreign oil is expensive and difficult, and U.S. oil is cheaper and more readily available. So what do? In our great wisdom, we restrict the production of domestic oil, and we subsidize the import of foreign oil. How silly can you be? Yes, sir.
We read about the dollar being weak on the dollar exchange. How did it become politically feasible to unpeg the dollar, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of an unpegged foreign currency versus a pegged foreign currency?
It became politically feasible. Let me put that in a different way. The one thing that makes anything politically feasible, is a real crisis in which you have to do something. Where all of us stick in the muds. None of us likes to change our ways unless he has to. Why did Britain's going off the gold standard in 1931 become politically feasible? Because there was nothing else you could do. It was in a desperate state and it no longer could hold it. Why did the unpegging of the dollar in 1971 become politically feasible? Because there was nothing else you could do about it. Because there was a world crisis and you had to do something. And what you had to do, the only alternative, would have been either far-reaching exchange control over every aspect of international transactions, which wouldn't have worked for very long either, because human beings are too ingenious in finding ways around such controls, thank goodness. And so you either had to do that or you had to unpeg the dollar. That's what made it politically feasible. Why was it desirable to do so? For reasons I think that have already become clear in what I said. Because the most efficient way to make sure that flows of trade between different countries are appropriate is to have a free market exchange rate for currencies. The case for unpegging the dollar is identical with the case for not having wage and price controls at home. There is no difference in principle between freezing the dollar's price, and freezing the price of oil or any other product. Indeed, it's fascinating when you come to political feasibility. When President Nixon on August 15, 1971 unpegged the dollar, he established a free market in the dollar. He simultaneously went in the opposite direction by freezing domestic prices and wages. His left hand did not know what his right hand was doing. Yes, sir.
My question was economists have been speculating the issue of reestablishing price and wage controls. I guess you just commented on that. Would you like to elaborate on that a little further?
I am afraid that the chances that we shall have price and wage controls are unfortunately not negligible. It is a device that governments have repeatedly resorted to try to cover up the effects of their own policies. It is offered as a cure for inflation. It is not a cure for inflation. It has never been a cure for inflation. It is an alleged cure that is far worse than the disease, because its effect is to repress the symptoms, to repress the consequences of the more basic force. I always say that if you want to analyze wage and price control, the simplest analogy that brings it home is to think of a kettle on your stove in which there's water, and the water is boiling. It's got a cover on it, and the boiling water is threatening to throw the cover off. Now, obvious, sensible thing to do is to turn down the heat under the kettle. Another thing you can do is to take a brick and put it on top of the kettle, and at the same time turn up the heat. That is precisely what President Nixon did in 1971, when he simultaneously put a brick on top of the kettle by freezing prices and wages, and at the same time launched on a more expansive monetary and fiscal policy, which turned up the heat under the kettle. And what happened? The lid of the kettle blew up. You held it down for a little while, and then you had a 12%, 13% inflation. That has been the experience every time, not simply over the last 20, 30 years, but for 2,000 years. Emperor Diocletian tried the same thing in Rome 2,000 years ago with identically the same results. So I have nothing but a negative opinion about wage and price controls. Yes, sir.
Well, I have seen that the free trade ideal has remained mostly an ideal we are striving for. We have seen that in continental Europe, they are leaving it aside every time some of their economic advantages are involved. I'm very concerned with what happens to the farmer here in Kansas. I've been a long-time resident, and I've been thinking the following. Last year, we exported a lot of grain. It went to Europe, and I think 2/3 went to Russia, to the Soviets. Now, what happened in those countries, in the purchasing countries, they had to pay in their currency about 15% less than what they paid a year before. This was due to the dollar devaluation. By that situation, I figure that the Russians have received a bonus of maybe $1.5 billion, which inflation has paid for. In other words, the American taxpayer. So what would you think, Dr. Friedman, if somebody came up with an innovation, with an idea to establish an offset, an equalization for this bonus of the dollar devaluation to people that buy in Rotterdam, to people that buy in Russia?
I think it would be a very bad idea.
I would say, Dr. Friedman, it would require no bureaucracy whatsoever. It would be handled by the bank that receives the payment drafts, and then this money could genuinely be given to the farmer, out of whose hide it was taken in the first place.
It was not taken out of the hide of the farmer. I beg your pardon. A market is a market. You know, I did not hear any complaints from farmers at the time that farm prices were abnormally high. Did you? What is this? Are we going to have a game of heads I win, tails you lose? Agriculture is an industry like every other industry. The farmer is an entrepreneur and a businessman. He is in a business which has a characteristic feature of having a fluctuating income. Obviously, in going into that business, he takes into account the fact that some years his income will be high and some years his income will be low. I do not believe it is true, as you say, that anything has been taken out of the hide of the farmer. On the contrary, if we take the experience of the United States over the past 20 years, we have had enormous governmental subsidies to the farmer. Now, the farmer hasn't benefited from that. Let me go slowly. You see, the problem with all of these things like you're describing is that they never have the results that the well-intentioned people who propose them intend to have. What is the effect of spending a lot of money trying to help the farmer? The effect of it is, first of all, to encourage more people to be farmers than otherwise would. Second of all, to make costs of producing agricultural products higher than they otherwise would be, because the counterpart of this is that you take land out of cultivation. It has a lot of side effects which eat up a large fraction of the gain, but that doesn't reduce the cost to the taxpayer. The taxpayer has paid twice. He has paid in the form of higher prices for his food than he need have paid, and he has paid second in the form of the taxes. Now, so far as the Russian case is concerned, I believe you have to be very careful here. I think we should allow the Russians freely to buy all the agricultural products they want, provided they pay for it with their own money, out of their own pockets, and we don't subsidize them. The real problem with the Russian purchases is that in large part it has been subsidized by loans from Western countries. Insofar as those loans are made by private people, that's their business. They're risking their money. Insofar, however, as they have been government guaranteed, as they often have, I am opposed to that. I do not believe that we ought to guarantee loans to the Russians. But then I think we ought to say, okay, if the Russians want to buy wheat, fine. So far as the common market is concerned, they have engaged in agricultural protectionism on a large scale, as you say. They are making a mistake to doing that. They are already suffering by paying a higher price for their agricultural products than they need to. We ought to encourage them to reduce their barriers, of course, on trade. But I think, how many times have you and I heard the story that here is a particular government reform which will not require a bureaucracy? I'm sorry, sir, there is no such animal.
I stand corrected with pleasure.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Friedman, there are people in agriculture who feel that farm programs work to the disadvantage of the American farmer, but perhaps for a different reason than you cited in the formal portion of your lecture. What would you say to the argument that someone in agriculture may make, that farm price support programs for agriculture are a disadvantage to the farmer because an urban-oriented Congress has learned how to use farm subsidies to increase domestic farm production far and above what the free market itself would have dictated?
Well, there are... you're raising, as you realize, an extremely complex question, which does not admit of a one- or two-sentence answer. I realize, and I did not mean, and I do not mean, to suggest that all farmers or all farm organizations are in the same class. They're not. The Farm Bureau Federation has, over most of its existence, been a staunch supporter of free markets in agriculture. It has, in general, been opposed to the kind of restrictive measures and price supports and so on that have been followed. And I believe that the argument you make is a valid one. This is why I said earlier that although the taxpayer has paid heavy sums, it is not clear that the farmer has benefited. But also it's not clear that the consumer has benefited. Because what we have done in large part over past periods is to dispose of those extra artificially produced surpluses. In my opinion, the urban-oriented legislator who has been benefiting his constituents in this way. It's a very complicated question. There is no doubt that resistance to high farm price supports has been increased by the presence of more and more of a larger and larger urban population and a larger representation. See, I think what you're describing is a much more general proposition. Almost every government policy may have short-term benefits to small groups, but in the long run, it tends to help nobody but simply waste the money. And the reason for that, in general, is the kind of thing you're describing here. Because if government is going to give away $1 billion, it pays people to spend $1 billion to get it. Now, the people who get it aren't always the ones who spend the money. Some people are disappointed. They engage in a lottery. They spend money in the hope of getting a government measure which will benefit them, and they lose. Other people win the prizes. But on the average, the group as a whole is likely to lose. Why does it lose? Because in addition to the money that's taken from the taxpayers, of the money that's taken from the taxpayers, a commission is taken off the top by the bureaucrats who collect it and the bureaucrats who distribute it. So you take $1 out of the right-hand pocket of people in order to put 75 cents back in the left-hand pocket. And that's the kind of thing you have in the case of agricultural subsidies, in my opinion. Yes, sir.
In a recent interview of U.S. News and World Report, Secretary of the Treasury Blumenthal blamed our current rising inflation in a large part on our foreign trade and unions. He did, however, say that the government was little to blame. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes? Unfortunately, it is one of the defects of our political system that we always put a Secretary of the Treasury and other high government officials into a position in which, when they make public statements, they are almost driven. Well, what's the word I want to use? I want to use a polite word, equivocate. Secretary Blumenthal knows as well as you and I do that inflation does not come from trade unions. That doesn't mean that trade unions aren't grasping. Of course they are. But they don't produce inflation for one simple reason. They do not own a printing press on which you can turn out green pieces of paper. The only such printing press is in Washington. I say printing press, of course, in the modern age we do it in a more sophisticated way. We use bookkeepers and accountants and computers. But it comes down to the same thing. Inflation is made in Washington because only Washington can create money. And any other attribution to other groups of inflation is wrong. Consumers don't produce it. Producers don't produce it. The trade unions don't produce it. Foreign sheiks don't produce it. Oil imports don't produce it. What produces it is too much government spending and too much government creation of money and nothing else. Yes, sir. Before you clap, let me point out that the reason why we have too much printed spending and too much printing of money is because you people want it. You and I. We're citizens. We run this country. If Congress has been voting higher and higher spending, why? Because it has been politically profitable for them to do it. If they have been voting higher spending and not voting the higher taxes to pay for it, why? Because it's been politically profitable to do it. We would all like to get something for nothing. And so the political process has been leading to Congress increasing spending, not increasing taxes, and financing the difference by the hidden tax of inflation. I think we are unwise. But let's not blame the others. The problem, you know, in that famous statement of the cartoonist, we have met the enemy and they is us. Yes, sir.
If we lower our government's tariffs, what will happen to our unions?
Which unions? Those unions that are in export industries will benefit. Those unions which are in industries which at the moment could be substituted for by imports would lose. There is no single statement that can be made about unions any more than there is about any other organization. What is true is that free trade, let's broaden your question, because we ought not to look only at unions. We have unions that are labor monopolies. We also have producer monopolies. We also have restrictions on free competition on the side of producers. There is no more effective way in my opinion, of promoting competition than free trade. If you want to cut down monopoly power in this country, the way to do it is not to double the budget of the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and have more 20-year suits against IBM. The way to do it, the most effective single way to do it, would be to enact free trade so that competition worldwide would come to bear, and that would undermine monopoly powers all over of unions on the one hand and of industrial monopolies on the other. Yes, ma'am.
From what I've read and have learned, I seem to feel more sympathy for your policies than some of, in your opinions, than the others. I wondered what books or writers besides Adam Smith, as you mentioned, influenced you more towards the positions you hold. What facts, what learnings and things?
Well, that's a very interesting and a very difficult question to answer, because I really can't answer you in terms of a single book or a single one or two books. I was trained as an economist at the University of Chicago in an excellent Department of Economics, I think the greatest in the country, even before I was there. And it's an interesting thing that professional economists in general, in their professional work, are led by a study of the way in which a market operates to be far more sympathetic to the use of the market than are most other groups. The great books in this tradition, after Adam Smith, are, of course, the works of David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Alfred Marshall, and coming down to the present day, Frank Knight, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises. You have a great series of books, in Britain, Lionel Robbins, John Jukes. It's very hard to name just one or two. I think one of the most important of all the books that influenced a lot of people, myself included, was Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944. And it remains a powerful and compelling book on what I think is not so much in the area of free trade as in the broader problem, the major problem of our time. Yes, sir.
In your formal lecture, you mentioned the dollars and the yen and how they should try to equal. How long would this take, and what about the steel worker who is now being laid off? What will happen to this person?
Well, in the first place, it takes a very short period of time. The foreign exchange market is a very free and volatile market. With respect to the steel worker that is laid off, that is a problem that should not be related to international trade. We want to have an economy and a society in which you have flexibility, in which people shift from producing one product to producing another if demand changes. If the public at large suddenly decides that they would like to buy one kind of clothing instead of another kind of clothing. If people decide they don't want to have their hair cuts, what should be done about the unemployed barbers? And so on down the line. And the answer, I believe, there is, in the first place, we now have mechanisms, in my opinion, a unduly complex and extensive set of mechanisms to take care of people who are temporarily displaced on this ground. In my opinion, our present mechanisms are unwise, and what we should have from this point of view is a general provision all over to make sure that nobody is in distress. One steel worker may be a real problem, another may have immediate other sources of income which displace it. We ought not to have any program for steel workers. We ought not to have any program for barbers. If we're going to have a program, we ought to have a program to help anybody who is in distress. I've discussed this at some length in connection with proposals for a negative income tax elsewhere, and in my opinion, that would be an effective and ample solution to the problem. Yes, sir.
Dr. Friedman, we recently had a guest convocation.
I should say that we're going to have to close this off. Let's make this the last question, if we may. I just realized on my watch that we were running over time.
We recently had a guest convocation speaker in the name of Jane Fonda, who spoke to an overcapacity and, I might say, enthusiastic crowd regarding the fear of big business in influencing government decisions and running the world virtually. And I would say that she influenced a lot of people here, and although her speech might have been alarmist, there seemed to be quite a bit of credibility to it. Could you have some comment as far as what you feel?
Sure. There's a great deal of merit in the position she was taking. One of the reasons, you must distinguish sharply between being pro-free enterprise, which I am, and being pro-business, which I am not. Those are two different things. The reason I am pro-free enterprise, the reason I am for a free market on a political level, is primarily because I believe the problem in this world is to avoid a concentration of power, to have a dispersal of power. That unless we have a dispersal of power, we will not be able to maintain a free society. Now, Jane Fonda is right that if we have a system under which government is in a position to give large and does give large favors, it's human nature for people to try to get those favors. Whether those people are large enterprises such as the oil industry or the automobile industry or the steel industry, or whether they are small people like the farmers who are driving tractors around Washington, or whether they are representatives of other special groups. And in my opinion, the only way you can prevent that and make sure that businesses operate in the public interest is to force them to engage in competition one with the other. So that she is right insofar as she says there is a great danger of having large, small, and in-between corporations exert undue influence on government. Where people like Jane Fonda go wrong is in not recognizing what the answer is. They think that the cure to big government is to have bigger government, except with them running it instead of the people who now run it. But in my opinion, the only effective cure is to reduce the scope of government, to get government out of the business. If government is prohibited from engaging in activities which can benefit special groups, then those special groups will not have any incentive to go to Washington. For example, to dream an ideal. Suppose we could have a constitutional amendment prohibiting Congress from making any laws imposing tariffs. Well, there would be a lot of lobbyists in Washington who would lose their jobs overnight. That would reduce the incentive for corporations to try to affect government, and similarly down the line. So we must separate diagnosis and problem from cure, and I believe that that's the area in which she is likely to mislead the public. I want to say one more thing. If you've got a choice between big government and big business, there's one important difference. No big business, whether it be General Motors or U.S. Steel or any other, can get $1 from you unless you voluntarily pay it off and think you're getting your dollar's worth in return. General Motors cannot send a policeman to take money out of your pocket. It can only get money from you insofar as it can produce a product that you think worth buying. It may indirectly get money out of your pocket by operating on government to impose tariffs on foreign cars. That's why we oughtn't to do that. But in the market, no business, however big, can get money from you except by providing you with something you value in return. That's hardly the case with government. Big government can send a policeman and take money out of your pocket, whether you believe you're getting your money's worth or not. That's an enormous difference. It's a difference between freedom and coercion, and it's a difference that we can only maintain if we keep down the size and scope and role of government. Thank you.